speaking of the long haul, the way that we're thinking about things in terms of overcoming, the bubble that's potentially actively bursting right now as we speak, is the way in which we actually design the tokenomics of the protocol. And so one of the things that people have seen as history's played out of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and others is that in order to have sustainable tokenomics, there has to be something that thinks more in terms of the longer generation by generation approach. And so the way that we incorporate generations into the actual consensus algorithm's reward output itself is literally by measuring the computational speed of the network. Now, there's been a few other projects that have basically leveraged some sort of supply-demand dynamic, and we're not quite doing that in the same way. We do have a dynamic fee market for the nature in which like transactions will cost at certain points, so that if there's a hot interval that's like causing a lot of friction for getting traffic to flow through successfully, obviously the fees would rise in order to address the congestion. But that's not particularly unique or novel. But what is particularly unique or novel is instead of having something that is essentially like this, depending on the protocol, they do like a 10 or 20 or 50-year horizon where the token issuance flattens out if it's like a proof of work scheme, or that there is a economic policy of a over titrating percentage over time that eventually goes to 0% issuance, and then there's just transaction fees or something as part of the nature of the protocol. Instead of doing that, we've actually taken this notion of hybridizing this proof of work system where you do have tapering issuance because there is natural stages in which the market reaches saturation. And you can see that happening in practically every industry over the course of about 10 years, over and over and over again. And instead of like simply succumbing to those patterns and designing a short-term thing that will rapidly hype up, it doesn't matter that it tapers off because we're just in it for a short term. Instead, we're thinking about it for the long term, that every single one of those 10-year cycles, we want to actually capture the new generation of technology that has emerged, incentivize its adoption and use, and then also give people a new opportunity as newcomers to participate meaningfully in the protocol in ways that is very hard to do when you get into the later stages. For example, on Bitcoin, you do not have people running new miners today who have not been in the mining space to any significant degree. You'll have a few hobbyists that try this. You'll have a few people who will buy one of those mining rigs and they'll try it, but you don't actually have like large masses of people who are suddenly deciding, I'm going to become a Bitcoin miner, because realistically the competition bar is way too high. And so mining pools have basically consolidated into a handful of like maybe three to six individual organizations, and they control the majority of the hash rate of the network. And so that's very harmful to the economic security of the network. And so very similarly with Ethereum, there is the same problem with the nature of how much capital has converged on people who are willing to put forth the effort to do validation. And so by consequence, you have Lido and Coinbase essentially being over 50% of all staked ETH. And you can make arguments that like these are good stewards of the protocol, like they have no interest in engaging in malicious ways, but that's not important. What's important is that if the protocol is intended to be decentralized, then your goal is to get as many people to actively participate in the decentralization of that protocol and not converge onto a handful of a small set of individuals. And so this is something that we're even seeing right now in our own 2.0 release, where the nature of how the mining algorithm currently works is something that's producing a lot of convergence, that there's just, it's getting into a smaller number of individual nodes that are participating. And that is not ideal. That is not something that is healthy. And that is why we are pushing so hard and so fast to get to one where the proof of meaningful work algorithm works in a completely different way, that things are more sharded out, that it is much harder for miner centralization to be a pressure of the network. And that comes back full circle to the nature of how we are planning for the long term of the network. And so these are the kinds of things that I want people to think about. Like when you look at how history repeats, there is this nature of people to just like not consider how those things happened and apply them to how things are currently happening, because they'll just argue that this is too new, this is too unique, that this won't happen again in the same way, and yet we just find ourselves making the same mistakes and making the same decisions, and same outcomes ultimately emerge. And so that's what's playing out today, and this is how we think about the nature of how this company is meant to operate, how this protocol is intended to be built, and how we intend to solve some of the most severe harms that have happened to this industry.